Okay, last of my TED Talk, mitigation strategies. Premise number 3 of the lawsuit, insufficient mitigation. So, AUARs by Minnesota law must include a plan specifying the mitigation measures that will be imposed upon future development within the area in order to avoid or mitigate potential environmental impacts. That's the law. Premise number 3 says, Pine Island, you did not do that. The Environmental Quality Board has emphasized that the mitigation plan for has to, again, be directly connected to any potential direct, indirect, or cumulative impacts of the project. And here's what it says. It says, the agency, the Environmental Quality Board, says that it must be understood that the mitigation plan is a commitment by the responsible governmental unit to prevent potentially significant impacts from occurring from specific projects. It's more than just a list of ways to reduce impacts. It must include information about how the mitigation will be applied and assurances that these mitigation strategies will in fact happen. That's the law. That's what it says. Now, the responsible governmental unit of this is the city of Pine Island. But the mitigation plan highlighted in the environmental review, the AUAR, by the city, the RGU, responsible governmental unit, only amounts to a list of ways that impacts could be reduced and facts about permitting. It doesn't actually contain substantive information about how the mitigations will be applied, how they're directly connected to any potential direct, indirect, cumulative impacts of the project. So, examples of this, they say that on water appropriation, remember 55.7 million gallons a year, apparently just for kitchens, sinks, and bathrooms. The mitigation strategies for the water use amount to 3 bullet points listing factual information about when a DNR permit is required. Remember how impacts in the environmental review would include things like a groundwater analysis, an aquifer analysis. How is it going to impact the wells in the area? This project is increasing, 50% of what the city's currently using for water. All of the people combined in the city. What is that water use going to do? And a mitigation strategy would say, these are the potential impacts to the well, and here's how not only could we maybe reduce that impact, but avoid it altogether. But if you didn't do that analysis, then you can't have an actual mitigation plan to address any potential impacts in an effective way. All they did was list DNR permitting processes and requirements. That's not actually a mitigation strategy, nor is it a plan to follow through on any said mitigation. Air quality mitigation strategies implement best management practices. BMPs is what they say. That's the mitigation strategy. Now remember, air quality impacts, that's your emissions, the equivalent of 8.1 gas power plants going in up the street from most of our homes. But all they say is that they will implement best management practices. But they don't actually specify what any sort of best management practice is. They don't list what they are. They don't even state what the mitigation strategies of those best management practices are. It simply says best management practice strategies may include watering truck use, dirt pile stabilization, dust suppressant, and vehicle and idling minimization. That's all just related to construction. There's nothing about even operational best management practices for air pollution. There's a whole part of the project left out, and the mitigation plan doesn't even make any sort of definitive commitment to even requiring any of the BMP's best management practices that they attempted to list. And so greenhouse gas emissions, again, remember 8.1, natural gas power plants is the equivalent. They included a quote or a lengthy list of mitigations that could be considered or encouraged where possible. But again, remember that the Environmental Quality Board, the EQB, actually requires a mitigation plan and explanations of where and when mitigation is possible and what is it addressing, and you have to say how you're going to implement it and then commit to doing it. But they didn't actually do any of that. So mitigation, not sufficient. And if the city also fails to specify mitigation measures that will be imposed upon future development within the area in order to avoid or mitigate potential environmental impacts. Now, we're much farther along in the timeline than when this lawsuit was filed. We know a lot more information. 9 data center buildings in this data center campus. That's a lot of potential direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts that need mitigation. When it's not 1 building, it's 9. But the environmental review, the AUAR, doesn't say anything about how many buildings. It just says technology center. That's actually a key distinction. It's not specifically mentioned in the data center in the lawsuit here, but that's a key distinction that's actually really important at the local level. You can't just say data center. You need to specify data center campus. That involves how many data center buildings and what size are those buildings and what's the power of each of those buildings and what are all the potential impacts of those buildings. Like all of those things you should actually be laying out. That's part of being detailed in what you're building, but the city wasn't detailed in that. So the conclusion also is problematic because with the environmental review that they did, the AUAR, no additional review would be needed for any potential future build out of the project. So you can't sit there and say, well, they didn't fully give all the city approvals for phase 2, therefore there's going to be another environmental review. No, this environmental review is all that there is. And the AUAR is structured in such a way that as long as you stay in the initial scopes, stay within the scope of the initial AUAR that you're doing, you can do whatever you want without any further additional review. Now, ordinarily, a 3 million square foot industrial building, which is what a data center is, and even just a 3 million square foot data center, would require an EIS, the environmental impact statement, because it would trigger mandatory categories. But that EIS would no longer be approved or needed or required because the city approved this AUAR. That is incredibly generic and vague in its description. And they specifically say it's got some very broad and undisclosed development assumptions. And because the lack of detail in the AUAR, a data center with up to 55.7 million gallons of water per year for any purpose, any impacts to the grid, any number or type of backup generators, and up to 3 million tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions, 8.1 power plants, any level of light pollution, and any level of cumulative environmental effects could claim that it's consistent with the development assumptions outlined in the AUAR, and therefore would be exempt from further environmental review. That's a problem. So, that is why there is a lawsuit that got started in the first place. And allowing this environmental review to stand as it is actually violates Minnesota environmental law, because the whole purpose of environmental review is that you study the potential and known direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of what you're doing, so that you know how to put in the proper mitigation strategies, and you know that what you're building is not going to cause harm. That's the whole purpose of the environmental review. And if you drop the lawsuit and you dismiss it and you start building when your environmental review is inadequate, unless you stop the project through a court injunction, for example, you're going to end up building something that can cause irreparable harm before the environmental review is actually like with an inadequate environmental review. And you need that court injunction to not do that. That's the whole point of the law. And if you build something before doing environmental review, you're defeating the entire purpose of having the environmental review in the first place. That's not how this is supposed to work. So that's why a court injunction was granted. It is not a frivolous lawsuit. This matters. 8.1 power plants, the equivalent of that, going in up the street. If you have asthma, any sort of breathing condition, you should be worried. And you should not be standing there giving a stamp of approval to anything that says, hey, we're going to put this up the street and it doesn't matter. We can do whatever we want. That's not okay. So, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.